You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The more we hear and the longer it goes on, the less likely it seems that Tarik Cohen is going to be part of the Chicago Bears in 2022. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. On the show today, we're talking all things Tarik Cohen. We'll go through his injury, the timeline, how we've gotten up to this point, and some of the things specifically we heard from new Bears general manager Ryan Poles from the NFL scouting combine this week. Not really committing or giving much of an answer either way on Tarik Cohen, which may have said everything it needed to say. We'll look at sort of what this offense would look like with him, without him, how the state of this running back room, and what the future may hold at that position for the Bears, and also some of the implications of, okay, how does that affect the salary cap? Are there injuries, punt returning, the running back room, and so much more. Well, let's go through and make sure we kind of all understand how we got to this point with Tarik Cohen, because it's given with the pandemic and the way that time has elapsed, it's hard to, you kind of forget that Tarik Cohen's missed almost 2 full seasons with this. It was week 3 of 2020 of the last Mitch Trubisky season that Tarik Cohen suffered a torn ACL against the Atlanta Falcons. And of course, torn ACL, you would expect him to be out for the rest of that season, but presumably you would have almost a full 12 months before the following season would begin. And so you would like to think that he could be ready to go by week 1 of 2021. And that was sort of the expectation, that like he would be back for training camp. But then, starts on the physically unable to perform list this season now, this most recent year. And that kept him downside for I think a minimum of 6 weeks. But we thought, okay, maybe he just needs a little bit more time. ACL tears can be major and can be to different degrees, and different bodies take different amounts of time to heal. But then he just never came off of it. And now has missed essentially 2 full seasons, or I guess like 1 3/4 season with this ACL injury. And so Bears general manager Ryan Poles was asked at the combine, what's going on with Tarik? What's his status? How are you handling that this offseason, and whether or not he's going to be around for the team? And then there's a follow-up question in here that's a little bit quiet, where they ask him straight up, is Tarik Cohen healthy right now? And you don't get a straight answer.
Yeah, it just comes down to that communication and conversations with Andre Tucker's, one of the best in the league. And we're just going to have those conversations to see where everything stands and make the best decision we can make at that time.
Is he healthy now?
I really don't want to get into the medical piece of individual players, but we'll just take it a day at a time to figure out where he's at for us.
Ryan Poles would have had every opportunity there to say, yes, Tarik Cohen is healthy, and we want him to be back and a part of this offense. We're looking forward to having him in our running back room and complementing the other pieces that we have on this offense and implementing him into our plans. But he didn't say that. He said, I trust our medical staff. We're taking it a day at a time, and I don't want to get into players' medical specifics. And that, to me, tells us pretty much everything we need to know, or at least answers the question. How about that? It does sort of answer the question of, no, he's not healthy, or he's not ready to go. Because that idea of healthy when it comes to Tarik Cohen and this knee, it has been hard to define and kind of hard to pin down, because he did an interview, I think, on some sort of podcast. I'm not sure actually the backstory of the people he was talking to, but he sort of explained why he hadn't been back. The quote from Tarik Cohen was, quote, "I'm scared to come back a different player, not the same when I was. I won't let myself come back before I'm ready and before I can feel I can put the same performances on that I was putting on before I got hurt." So you wonder if there's a mental aspect of this in addition to a physical aspect in terms of like obviously like the muscle and the knee. And I mean, again, I don't pretend to have any sort of understanding of medical information whatsoever, but like, there's something to be said about when you're recovering from an injury and needing to trust that knee, that when you plant your foot to cut, that it's going to hold up and it's going to be stable and rebuild some of not only the actual strength of the muscle and the ligaments or whatever, but also like the trust in your body that it is going to hold up. And of course, Cohen being a player whose skill set is 100% reliant or mostly reliant on speed, quickness, and explosiveness, that ability to move, you can see where it could have a potentially significant impact on this recovery and how this is going to go. But it leaves some very unclear futures here, very immediately like, okay, so it's been 2 full seasons now, and he's had a full offseason now, and now the beginning of this offseason to recover. How much longer is it going to take? Is it going to get 100% better? I mean, how can you expect, or what can you expect? What can you rely on? What can you reliably expect to have from Tarik Cohen as a result? And it just seems to paint this picture of like the Bears maybe being ready and seeming quite ready, I think, to unfortunately just cut bait and move on from Tarik Cohen. Not because he's not a good player, not because he's not a good person, right? I mean, we all like Tarik Cohen. It's definitely not about him, but it's about, in some part, the money that you're paying him to get nothing for the last 2 seasons, and also just the state of the roster elsewhere, and just needing to have a more reliable option there, and kind of realizing that you can't just hold on to this forever. So we'll look at where this Bears running back room stands and kind of where he would fit if he did come back, or what they're going to be missing if he's not here, next on Locked On Bears. The NFL Scouting Combine is a great way to get some football-related bets still going out there and having some fun with the prospects running around in Indianapolis. And our friends at BetOnline.net have all the top odds, totals, and player performance props you need to know. Of course, you can bet on 40-yard dashes, bench press reps, 3-cone times. I mean, so many more, not only just for individual players' performances, but then like, will the fastest 40 time be under a certain mark? How fast will Rich Eisen run his 40-yard dash? Much more. Really, our friends at BetOnline are the sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just football in the combine, but basketball, soccer, hockey, boxing, tennis, UFC, you name it, BetOnline has it. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn all about the trends in action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. A lot of this Bears offense, at least from a building block standpoint, is going to start with that running back position, of course, around Justin Fields. And it really was, I would say, other than like, Darnell Mooney, like it was what the Bears could rely on the most, where they seem to have the most consistent talent last season was in that backfield. Even with David Montgomery getting hurt and Khalil Herbert stepping in, he looked like, a phenomenal rookie running back that can be an important part of this backfield moving forward. Plus, I mean, you had Damian Williams in there, although he was kind of average, and we kind of were wondering why he kept getting carries over Khalil Herbert, because he just didn't seem like a major like difference maker, but he did give them an extra body there. I think in some part, maybe anticipating the lack of return of Tarik Cohen, bringing Williams in instead. Well, and also they didn't know Khalil Herbert would be what Khalil Herbert was, right? They signed Damian Williams first, or at least we didn't know how good Khalil Herbert was going to be. I don't remember exactly which month Damian Williams was signed, but regardless, right? He was necessary depth going into the season. Seemed a little bit less like it now, but I think when you sort of add to this conversation of like writing on the wall for Tarik Cohen, there was another set of comments from the general manager, Ryan Poles, when he was asked specifically what the bright spots were on this Chicago Bears offense. He specifically referenced the running back position as a big bright spot, And it was a big bright spot without Tarik Cohen there.
Bright spot was Mooney. And then just, as guys have come in to work out, we've had the opportunity just to introduce each other, and he stopped in, and I was like really blown away by the person. So that was a bright spot. The running back situation's good. There's good offensive linemen as well. It's just continuing to tweak that and making sure we get everyone that's fit and in the right spots. So that was a pleasant surprise.
The running back situation's good. That was good without Tarik Cohen specifically, right? They didn't need Tarik Cohen for the running back position to be good and to be one of the positions that Ryan Poles specifically pointed out there. And I do think there's more we can read into that answer at another time when he talks specifically about like the bright spots is Mooney and the running backs. And he talked a little bit about the offensive line in there, but like not a mention of Cole Kmet, Jimmy Graham, the tight ends, not a mention of Allen Robinson or Marquise Goodwin or Damiere Byrd, right? The players that he didn't mention there are just as interesting, I think, as the players he did mention there. But specifically with the running back room, right? Obviously, Tarik Cohen is, or I guess was, a skilled, talented player, right? A weapon for any offense when healthy and on the field. And of course, that's the key issue right now. But you could see where if you had Tarik Cohen with David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert, you could do some fun things, right? You could have more opportunities to have more than one of them on the field at the same time. You could play Tarik Cohen more at wide receiver and in the slot and move him around as a jack of all trades type. You could have, he's that type of mismatch player that can't play at a number one wide receiver level, but can truly like run wide receiver routes downfield. So you can sort of go with an empty backfield and have him at a receiver spot and still be able to motion him back in and run the ball and make defenses sort of understand or have to account for him and the possibility that he could be a runner or a pass catcher. The way we've seen, not that he's Deebo Samuel, but the way we've seen teams like use players like Deebo Samuel in some of these hybrid running back wide receiver roles, I think Cohen had and could still again, when healthy, have the skill set, the tools, the speed and everything to be able to do that. And the shame here is that the dude's 27 years old, right? I mean, he's not old. He's not past his prime. He's not physically slowing down. I mean, the knee injury could physically slow him down, but like in terms of the stage of his career, right? When I say like I don't want to imply that he can't ever do it again, but it's just like you got to see it with the knee injury, and that's the big concern. You could also see where not having him on the roster in terms of releasing him or whatever they end up doing with him, I guess maybe a trade possibility. It's complicated with the injury, but regardless, if he's on the team or if he's not, you are impacting the snaps, the carries, the catches for David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert, right? Any carry that Tarik Cohen is getting is not going to either of those guys. And ideally, you would like to give them as many as you can this season. They're both talented running backs who can do a lot of different things. And we kind of felt like last year, Damian Williams' 40 carries could have been distributed among those two and been not infinitely more productive, not every single time more productive, but just better for the Bears in terms of getting those guys more reps and utilizing the younger players and not needing Williams to just be the Damian Williams that he was. Or even Damian had 23 targets and 16 catches and was a lot of times that sort of third down, passing down, shotgun running back. And Khalil Herbert can catch the ball out of the backfield just fine. David Montgomery can catch the ball out of the backfield just fine. Of course, Tarik Cohen would do that very well too. But if you take Cohen out of it, then those opportunities are able to go more toward Herbert and Montgomery and give them the playing time that you want to, because it's good to have those types of playmakers and get the ball in their hands as consistently and as frequently as possible. And so I think, obviously, you would, in an ideal world, Cohen is back and Cohen is healthy and he's a part of this offense. But they don't need him. The running back field did just fine without him last season, and he will, if he's back, he will take snaps away from Montgomery and Herbert. And there's something to be said about freeing up more opportunities for the two of them to carry the ball and catch the ball and be more involved in the Bears offense, because they are talented players who need the ball. It's not taking anything away from Cohen, but just you can't combine that inconsistency with what the Bears already have available to them, and it becomes that much easier to move on from Tarik Cohen this offseason. The problem is moving on from him is going to be a little bit complicated with the injury. So we'll kind of dive into what that process could look like and what other sort of effects it could have on this Bears team next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars, Built Bars. They really do taste like candy bars. It's not an exaggeration. Every Built Bar is soft and easy to chew, covered in 100% real chocolate, head to toe, completely covered in chocolate with a delicious gooey inside that comes in a bunch of great flavors that sound like candy too. I mean, salted caramel, chocolate raspberry, coconut brownie chunk is one of my personal favorites. It's a limited flavor. They only have it ever so often. I mean, I promise you'll find a delicious flavor that you like, but not only does it taste good like a candy bar, it's good for you. Every Built Bar is low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. There's not another protein bar product on the market that tastes this good and has this much nutritional value. Head on over to built.com. Enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Moving on from Tarik Cohen has some complicating factors, specifically because of the injury. I'm not an expert on how injury settlements work in the NFL, but it's not always as simple as just release a player and let him go and take your free salary, your salary cap savings and eat your dead money. There's future money owed on it, and sometimes you can, because he's injured, when you settle, it's a settlement much like a lawsuit, right? You're agreeing to some sort of amount of payoff or payout in order to exit him from that contract while he's injured, right? And it's a settlement. It kind of has to be mutually agreed upon to some extent, and it's not always like that the player really wants to get out of the contract, but just so they sort of understand that, like, hey, there's kind of consequences to this, and it might just be easier for everyone involved. And yeah, otherwise you're going to end up, there's arbitration, I think, and there's a lot of different ways that this can kind of go back and forth. And so it's hard to sit here and say right now, like, depending on what his injury status is, because we don't even actually get a straight answer on that. Can the Bears just straight up cut him? I'm not sure. If they did, they would save about $2.25 million on the salary cap. Not a ton, but something. His cap hit this year is set to be $5.75 million. Pretty a decent middle of the road contract for a running back. His salary next year is set to be $7.5 million, which is getting up there again now for a running back that hasn't played the last 2 seasons. And remember, he just signed a contract extension right before. So earning that, he's been receiving that elevated salary post rookie contract, but hasn't really necessarily been on the field for it. And of course, I want him to make as much money as he can. Absolutely. Every player should make as much money as he can, but they're in a position right now where if you can't really afford, well, it's not good business to have $5.75 million tied up in a player that you're not sure what his availability is going to be based on an injury that's coming up on 2 full years old. And so there's a slight salary cap saving from cutting him like normally. You could make him a post June 1st cut, which is a designation you do to spread out the salary, the dead money left in the contract. The Bears still owe him a little over $3 million in guaranteed money that's prorated to be paid out this season and next season. And so you could designate him a post June 1st cut, spread the dead money out over 2 years and save $4 million this year, and then just still owe him 1.75 on next year's dead salary cap, just to spread it out over 2 years instead of just this one season. But the amount of money you're saving there, an extra 1.75 million, is again sort of not negligible, but I don't know that it's drastic enough to pull out any sort of complicated salary cap arrangements there. I think ultimately will move on from him at some point. They will save a couple of $1 million in the process, and they will be fine in the backfield, right? They have running back talent. I am curious then what that leaves them at the punt return spot, because we sort of touched around the Jakeem Grant conversation this offseason of like, do you re-sign Grant purely as a kickoff and punt return guy? Because you don't want Jakeem Grant anywhere significantly in your offensive wide receiver depth chart. You need to upgrade wide receiver to a point where Jakeem Grant is not good enough to crack your top 4. And so if you're re-signing Jakeem Grant, you're paying him as almost purely a kick returner and not expecting offensive contributions, because you should in theory have a better group of wide receivers than Jakeem Grant at this point. And so if you're moving on from Tarik Cohen, does that put more pressure or more motivation to re-sign Jakeem Grant as that return man? Because you have Khalil Herbert who can do kickoffs. He can be your kickoff return guy, no problem. But Tarik Cohen was kind of your punt return guy before the injury. And the idea was that, well, if Cohen comes back, he can return punt again, and you don't really need Jakeem Grant at that point. Or does this push you to instead sign someone else at the punt return spot, or another return man, or another receiver that can do both and be a little bit better on offense than Jakeem Grant? This is not a crap on Jakeem Grant segment. I mean, it's just he hasn't proven to be a consistent offensive weapon yet, other than a couple of times they got the ball in his hands. But for the most part, it's the return game that you're deciding on for Grant. And without Cohen, you're kind of left with Daz Newsome as the punt returner under contract. I think they have Simba Webster still technically around from the practice squad, but that doesn't seem like a long-term solution there. So there's other considerations here that come with Tarik Cohen. You might also end up wanting to sign a new number 3 running back. You have Ryan Nall, but they haven't really seemed to trust him fully in that number 3 back role. And, could you re-sign Damian Williams? I guess, but that was more the Matt Nagy connection. I don't think that's in the plans. But, some other veteran minimum, nothing more than a veteran minimum type player as another backup and special teams player in the running back room that ideally is not going to take any offensive snaps from Montgomery or Herbert. But if one of them gets hurt, you would like to have somebody a little bit better than Ryan Nall that could come into that offensive rotation, but still primarily be a special teams guy. Just not a spot on the team that I'm going to spend more than absolutely the veteran minimum. So a few different considerations there for Tarik Cohen. I think you can easily cut him. Well, maybe not easily cut him in terms of the finances and the injury settlement stuff, but like from a roster construction standpoint, you can easily cut Tarik Cohen, replace a number 3 back with a veteran minimum, and bring in some kind of return man at some point in either the draft or the free agency, another receiver, somebody else that can be consistent in that spot. So it doesn't have to be a rotating mess of guys that are muffing it and fumbling it and just causing you trepidation every time you're back to return a punt. I'm not sure what the timeline is going to be for Tarik Cohen at this point. Certainly when they make some change, we can talk about it again and in the future. We'll keep a close eye on any and all transactions as maybe they cut some players to free salary cap space, or what they're going to do coming up on free agency here. So I hope you'll keep tuning in to the Locked On Bears podcast 5 days a week to keep up with all of our daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making us your first listen today and hopefully every day. Right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, we are your team every day. And I hope that every day the Locked On Bears podcast helps you bear down.